Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are located today. Welcome to our webinar today on the topic of publishing in the Journal of Counseling and Development. My name is Jennifer Cook, and I am one of the co-chairs for CEQUIN. My co-chair today, Emily Goodman-Scott, with whom I usually do these presentations, is not with us today because she is one of the people experiencing Hurricane Florence. So big shout out to all of our folks who are over on the East Coast dealing with that right now, and safety for them and to everyone who is out there. I wanted to let you know that we are going to be recording our call today, so anything that is said will be recorded and will be available to ACES members on the ACES website under CEQUIN. A few announcements as we get started today. We will be going to jump right into our presentation in a moment from our esteemed colleague who's with us today. But first, I wanted to share with you that the task forces are continuing their work and are always looking for volunteers. So I will put my email address in the chat here for you if you'd like to reach out to me. Similarly, we are looking for folks who may want to host CEQUIN meetings at the regional conferences. I will be hosting the one at North Central ACES, but if you are located in WACES, NAR ACES, SACES, or Rocky Mountain, we would love to have you host a meeting. These gatherings at the regional conference tend to be networking focused and really just get to know our other qualitative researchers who are in the region. So if you're interested in doing that, feel free to shoot me an email as well. And then finally, we're putting out a call for co-chairs for CEQUIN. Emily and I are in our third year of being co-chairs for CEQUIN, and we are about to pass that mantle along to some other folks. What you'd be doing is doing exactly what we've done, facilitating the work of CEQUIN. If you're interested, we take these names as interest, and this is important to know that the folks who co-chair or chair interest networks for ACES are appointed by the ACES president. So these would be suggestions that we would pass along, and hopefully we would start to, whoever is selected, we would start to mentor them into the process of being chairs and co-chairs for CEQUIN starting in the spring semester. So if you're interested, I hope that you'll reach out to me or to Emily, and again, I'll put our information into the chat. So our call today is going to be a little bit different than how it is often. We often have a presentation in which there's a PowerPoint presentation and the speaker is doing a great deal of lecturing for about 40 minutes, and then we usually take questions in the chat. Today, what we're going to do is Dr. Limburger-Truelove is going to begin with an introduction and talk a little bit about his role as editor of Journal of Counseling and Development. And we are going to really use a lot of your questions. So the things that you are dying to know about publishing qualitative research in the Journal of Counseling and Development and questions you have about that process, we're going to invite you to put those into the chat. And we're gonna get those answered for you, hopefully. Given that format, I think that we're gonna have a pretty good chance to be able to get through a lot of folks' questions today. So we're hoping that you're gonna be active in the chat. I'm gonna be monitoring that to ask questions, to pass those questions along to prompt, and then also Dr. Limburger-Truelove will be also reading through the chat and answering them in a way that makes sense, because sometimes my thought processes don't always make sense question-wise with the person who's doing the presenting. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker to you today. We have Dr. Matthew Limburger-Truelove, who is a professor of counseling at University of North Texas. And he is our new editor-elect for Journal of Counseling and Development. He transitions into that position a few months ago and is working to learn the ropes and to begin the process of becoming full-on editor for JCD. And we're really excited to hear about his insights regarding qualitative research, publishing qualitative research, and how that functions specifically within the context of JCD. So welcome, and thank you so much for your time today, and we're really looking forward to learning from you. I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks a lot. And so assuming folks do put in the chat, and I know you'll be translating a lot of this, Jennifer, thank you for doing that, by the way. And thank you to both you and Emily for asking me to do this. Please, you can address me by Matthew. Even my students, I kind of implore them to do the same. So Yeah, well, and I'd also like to thank everyone who's attending. I was actually just asking Jennifer the numbers, and like, well, this is some pretty daunting numbers, but you know, in counselor education, we're kind of accustomed to 10 to 15 at a time, but you know, unfortunately, with the hurricane and other inclement weather across the country, you know, we may or may not hit those numbers. But with that in mind, I want as much as is possible for the next hour to be as relevant to as many of you all as possible. So as prefaced, um, my agenda is simply to present some general schemes related to the journal, some specific things that are within my priorities as the incoming editor, because we do have an opportunity as an editor to generally shape at least the immediate future of the types of things that we look to highlight. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And then in each one of those regards, try to ground it very specifically in qualitative research. So thank you again for letting me have this opportunity. I really hope to you know, monologue no more than 10 to 20 minutes. And then the rest of the time, please, you know, do ask your questions, and I'll do my best to answer. So thanks again. So yeah, as Jennifer mentioned, the transition period, just to kind of explain a little bit behind that, given the volume of submissions that come into the Journal of Counseling and Development, which, you know, kind of oscillates anywhere between 300 and 500 in a year. And I do like to mention that just so that folks know um, just the amount of scholarship that the editor and the review staff is exposed to, which in some way kind of foretells, you know, as much as we as counselors don't like to be terribly competitive, there is a competitive nature to it. We accept from that about 10%, plus or minus 5, again, depending upon if we're closer to the 300 side of that range or the 500, which comes down to about 9 to 12 articles per issue. And also then within that, it also illustrates just the numbers of reviews that our review board has. We have about 95 members of the review board, probably many of whom are with us today. And then our associate editors, I think we have 8. And so if you do the basic math there, our associate editors do much of the heavy lifting for the journal in terms of helping with the disposition letters, helping with decisions, and they have a huge number of reviews at any given time. And so one of our goals is to remain incredibly timely. The history with JCD, dating back at least to Skip Niles, is to try to get reviews turned around within 3 months. The promise is a little bit longer than that, but that's the goal, right? I think the promise is a little closer to 5 or 6 months, but we really try to get 3 months. And so then that's contingent upon our reviewers having time on the reviews in a month, which sometimes sometimes happens. Our associate editors get a couple of weeks, and then I try to turn things around in a few days after it goes to the associate editors, um, you know, their queue, and I do my best to do that. So that's kind of a little bit about the generic process. You know, if you want me to kind of explicate with more depth, I would actually encourage folks to look at the author guidelines first, and that probably is the most important thing to do if you do want to be a successful author for JCD, is to adhere to the guidelines. What ends up happening is that we have an editorial assistant who is kind of the first line of defense. And if things are not adherence to APA formatting, the length, the required length, and other kind of nuances that are just kind of endemic to JCD, then what she will do is she will kick it back to the authors to give them an opportunity to get it into the appropriate format. And only then will it be dispensed out for a review. With the kind of additional kind of caveat that it has to also be within the scope of JCD. And I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about that later, because I think that's one of the things that's most challenging, because each of us assumingly has an identity as a counselor educator, even though we definitely receive a great number of articles from allied disciplines that probably fit more in their mind's eye from the development side, but not necessarily closely tied to counseling. But I think that for many counselor educators, trying to connect their identity with the nature of their research can be a bit dubious at times. Simply because you're a counselor educator constructing a study, be it qualitative, quantitative, or even a theoretical piece, doesn't necessarily mean that it's a counseling piece. It could more reflect a psychology piece, an assessment piece, or those types of things, which aren't necessarily within the scope. And so when folks receive a desk reject in the past, or in the last 3 months from myself, and there's some confusion, that oftentimes is the issue. And I think it's a function of not necessarily attending to the author guidelines. So one of my greatest recommendations would be just look really closely to those author guidelines. Um, Also, before I finish this, I really want, as I mentioned before, this to be as relevant to each one of you all. So if you think through those author guidelines, if you think through the things that you've seen published in the past, please do formulate questions. If we don't have an opportunity to get them now, or if there's things that come to mind after the group talks and we weren't able to either get to it, or again, it just kind of was a latent thought in your mind, don't hesitate to reach out to me. It really is one of my major priorities. One of my general foci as a kind of scholar is the idea around dialogical philosophy and learning from each other in communities of agreement. And so I can't improve as an editor if I don't know what the constituents of the journal are thinking. It can become a bit myopic on this side, just reviewing things. So please do reach out to me. So with all those things said, my primary focus, and in some ways it's always been a focus of the journal, but I really want to make it something very salient, and that is focusing on the numbers of empirical pieces related to counseling process and outcome. And that would sound pretty intuitive, given just even the name of the journal. But if we think back to, I think it was in 2010, one of my colleagues here wasn't, I had just actually started my new position here, not only with JCD, but at the University of North Texas. I was formerly at the University of New Mexico for a number of years. But one of my newer colleagues here, Dee Ray, she and her colleagues had done a meta-analysis, again, I think it was 2010, so it was the 10 years preceding then, of all the articles published in counseling journals. And it was an incredibly small number, I think 5 or 6% of the empirical pieces pertain to counseling. And I find this to be kind of a very dubious thing, because as a consequence of this, one, what are the other things? They oftentimes are us studying ourselves, which that can be very laudable, but it can also be very problematic, especially if scholarship is supposed to inform practice, if scholarship is supposed to inform our training and accreditation standards, policy, so on and so forth. Oftentimes what we are citing is our beliefs about ourselves. And again, while there's value in that, our primary constituents as counselors and counselor educators, as a consequence of the people whom we train, is clients in that experience. And so I really want to encourage folks to consider empirical work related to counseling process and outcome. Now, how does that pertain to qualitative research? Because some folks might erroneously believe that places qualitative at a deficit, and I actually believe that that's kind of the opposite, right? In some ways, because I think qualitative research has, or researchers have there's a huge gap in the literature relative to, especially the process, but also the lived experience of clients in terms of how they experience those psychotherapeutic interventions or preventative-based services, or how it affected the social systems around them. And so something that I would really love to see, and there's some great examples out there that I could certainly share from some of our allied journals or other human service journals. In fact, I was reading one yesterday where they had done a phenomenological analysis of the client's lived experiences in a mindfulness-based group working with teachers. And it was just incredibly well done. The writing was strong, the way that they constructed it. And I thought, if there were a template for the types of things that I would look for related to this primary focus on counseling process and outcomes, it would certainly be a good example. Now, that doesn't preclude other things. I mean, certainly there's other things around counselor education and supervision, though I think we do have a journal that focuses primarily on that, and that probably should be authors' first place to look at, given the scopes of the respective journals. Nonetheless, we still have a place for that in JCD. We certainly have a place for other non-specific to the counseling process or outcome that can inform counseling practice and outcome, and we certainly are looking towards those. But I'm not necessarily going to privilege those, as I might work with authors a little bit more if they're really focused on counseling process and outcome. part of this comes from my own biases. And, I know as qualitative researchers, we're supposed to talk about the positionality, or, taking from the old Greek, the epoche, And so for me, my work primarily is situated in two places. I do interventions, mostly for children and their families, oftentimes in situations of economic duress. Um, and, that certainly informs me as a counselor educator, and I would be naive to not confess that that certainly informs my work as an editor, at least in terms of priorities. Then I have a whole second space that I kind of is like my hobby academic work, and that's around the intersection of social justice and humanism. I was just most recently the editor of the Journal of Humanistic Counseling, and humanism as a broad, inclusive philosophy. Not, I think there's talked about some erroneous beliefs in our profession, or another of which is the humanism, that there's a specific type of humanism, whereas that's certainly not the case. Humanism is a paradigm at the kind of substratum of what counseling is, rather than just a certain version. But those things certainly inform how I will look at things as an editor. The relational nature of counseling, coming from the humanistic tradition, and again the social justice. Are we doing our work in such a way to ameliorate the best conditions for our clients and for the people who are working with our clients to be successful? So those are certainly things that I'd be remiss not to acknowledge to folks. Even though I don't necessarily have a background in qualitative research, I have a profound respect for qualitative research. Kind of aligned with those things that I mentioned related to my own scholarship. One of my favorite pieces I ever wrote, which was kind of in that hobby area of scholastic interest, was a conversation back and forth in defense of the symbolic nature of all research to tell a good story. And so, one of the things that I would suggest, and again, these are things that are some way inferred, but I want to make them very explicit, is that research first and foremost needs to tell a good story, but it needs to tell a good story within the agreed upon rules, or the ethos from which it comes from. So for example, in the qualitative tradition, you may or may not have training in one of the particular, the four main, and there's certainly multiple different permutations of qualitative research, but narrative, phenomenology, grounded theory, ethnography, case study. There's others of which, some of the derivative forms like portraiture, whatever those that are closest to your heart. I certainly encourage authors to honor and pursue those things that kind of fit them best, but nonetheless making certain that the methodology chosen best aligns with the research questions. And that's something that we see over and over again in JCD that may or may not help authors in the best way. So in other words, many times authors choosing a methodology because of their familiarity, as opposed to does that necessarily provide the best story for their research questions. The outgoing editor, Rick Balkin, and I were conversing in the car, my car. It was on Bluetooth. I wasn't terribly dangerous, but about a study that was really well done, but our associate editor of qualitative research, or one of the associate editors of qualitative research, was quite concerned that the authors described it as phenomenology, cited a number of their work and their expertise in phenomenology, but it was clearly not a phenomenological study. And though I have, I think, sufficient training in qualitative research, I have to rely upon the expertise of that associate editor. And so if we're not making it clear as to how our research questions are patently that research design, whether that's true or not, whether you intended it or not, our review board members and our associate editors are indicative of our readers. Those are the communities of agreement who will perceive our work. And so if that's how multiple experts are perceiving our work, the authors haven't necessarily been clear in, is this the most appropriate methodology? And so one of the things I would suggest folks to be most successful is, again, kind of honoring and staying in the space that you feel competent in, but while at the same time ensuring that your research questions, you can kind of coalesce those two to be successful. And I said, it feels a little odd just not being able to throw something, a big assertion out like that without some response. So, please, have some questions related to that, because I certainly want to learn from the experts in this room, this digital space. Some of the last things that I also want to talk a little bit about, much like in the spirit of this activity, one of my goals has also been to expand and rethink how we disseminate research. The reality, there's scholarship on scholarship, and this hasn't necessarily been done specific to counseling, but a few years back there was an article done, and they looked at 5 major disciplines, and I can't recall what those were. And they looked at the mode and median number of times that scholarly articles in those 5 disciplines were read. And the mode was 0 outside of the review process. And the median was, I think, 2, just approaching 2. And so if that's true, and I don't know if that's necessarily true in counseling, what is then the purpose of our scholarship? Who is it touching? Especially, I think that's especially important in a profession such as counseling, where we are a human service profession. Our work assumingly should be informing practice in such a way that hopefully it improves what we do, so that it can help improve or at least support the lives of the people who are important to us. And so some of the things to try to remedy the dubious amount of readership that may or may not be occurring in our profession is I want to work with some allies, some colleagues, in creating a podcast with successful authors in JCD, much like it sounds like you all do, which I actually was really impressed when I just heard Jennifer describe a little bit of what you all do, so that we can, again, disseminate the ideas, that we can get them out to folks in ways that best align with the ways that they are receptive to those things. And doing things such as this, where talking either as authors or editors about some of the scholarship to encourage more readership is also one of my priorities as editor. But especially around the ideas of podcasts, videocasts, and those types of things. So if you are a successful author, and when I say successful author, it means it's being accepted, and just thinking about time, or all of the review board staff already has incredibly busy schedules, but thinking about what we could handle would most likely be the folks who had an article accepted, and also it at least went through some burden of proof that work was valued by our review board, and so therefore probably would be perceived as valuable by more listeners. Something else that we're wanting to institute, and these are just kind of at the nascent stages, and so just kind of formulating the ideas. The Career Development Quarterly, some other journals across disciplines use something called brief reports, which are no less scholarly, but they tend to be a little bit shorter. I know that might hamstring some qualitative researchers, so that's part of the reason why I want to be very, very deliberate. When Rick and I first started talking about this a couple of years ago, before when I was just contemplating applying to be the next editor, that I thought was an interesting idea. But then, having thought about it, backpedaling a little bit, how can this accommodate all the different approaches, is something that we're still working on before we actually formalize it, but it is something that we're contemplating. And those brief reports would probably be about 10 or 15 pages. Again, mostly focused on the ideas of relevance for practice, and again, trying to make our literature more accessible, and not just something that's very insular and very no less scholastic, but to remove some of that kind of non-egalitarian, almost hegemonic way of research says this, and believe that, but instead translating it down in a very relevant way. And the final thing I really wanted to talk about is, in the spirit of dialogue, the ways in which I try to engender dialogue within the review process. So every manuscript that is submitted, unless, actually I can't think of an occasion that this would not be true, because even articles that we've received some from distant countries with very different formats, very different scopes, very different professions, even in those cases, I've provided full reviews. They wouldn't necessarily go through the full review process with other reviewers, but my belief is that actually, I want to talk about this in a different way. I loved when I was editor of the Journal of Humanistic Counseling. I really got to focus on issues that were really kind of close to my heart and ideologically aligned with things that I was interested in reading. JCD is not like that. JCD in some ways is kind of sausage making, you know, because you get every different topic from across 20 20 or more, I mean, at least 20 formal uh, divisions, myriad interest of across our profession. And there's no necessary common theme unless there's a special issue. And so you're trying to service the greatest number of individuals in the best way. And I'm very attracted by that idea, but I'm also acutely aware that that's, you know, kind of a difficult process to be everything to everyone. And so in the spirit of that, relying heavily on the review board members, but also for me personally, it was how then do we how then do we create an ethos, a culture in the spirit of that kind of relational humanism, equity, justice that I was very passionate about in the Journal of Humanistic Counseling, in a journal where it's incredibly diverse in terms of at least areas of interest and agendas, while it's incredibly high stakes. You know, I'm not naive to know that, you know, you have some of the smartest people in our profession receiving 90% rejection, you know, and most of the people who are doing most of the submissions are at the earliest part of their careers, where again, it's the highest stakes and they have the most incentive to be the most successful. So how do you do that to folks? And so as I saw it, you know, there was a time where I used to keep track of these. In my 8 years as editor of JHC, one of my favorite things to receive was letters from authors who received a rejection, not because they received a rejection, because I didn't like that. That was not a fun process, but who said, this was the kindest, most generous, and most helpful rejection letter I'd ever received. And as I think through that, I'd like to continue that. And I've tried to in the few months that I've been handling the queue, to continue to give that type of feedback. And in turn, in the spirit of the dialogical philosophy, I'm hoping that it will improve both in substance, but then also in terms of depth of inquiry, the review process. That my reviewers have always said, you know, looking at how serious you take every one of these reviews, you know, the all tides, you know, the all ships rise to rising tides type of approach. And because I think what that will do is that then if we have to reject 90% of the submissions, great submissions, many of which should be accepted, that assumingly those pieces will go to other journals within our discipline. And hopefully the helpful feedback, and when I say helpful, it's, you know, there's the philosopher Pascal said, there's really only one way to motivate people into change. And a couple hundred years later, cognitive psychologists have essentially done nothing more than just evince that idea to be true. And that is the first step. People must believe that you're on their side, that you're part of their tribe. And so in other words, you have to see within the mind's eye the perspective of that other individual, which should be easy for us as counselors, but many folks here probably have received reviews where it was disparaging, it was hurtful. And while we want to be critical for the purposes of growth, you have to be able to see what reasons did the person believe what they believe enough to commit it to paper as a part of the review process. And so then only from that place can we then offer alternative perspectives. And again, that gets into dialogical philosophy. And so one of my main priorities is to engender that culture within JCD. And I don't know if, you know, I used to be a review board member for many years. It's not to say that it wasn't there, but to make it a very explicit thing that our goal is not just to improve what gets accepted into JCD, but then to kind of reverberate out through the entire counseling literature, and which then hopefully affects practice and training and so on and so forth. And so that is a kind of a major priority of mine as well. And so I promised to only talk 20 minutes or 10 to 20 minutes, and I guess I had a lot more to say than I thought I did. But that's pretty much it. And I think I'll now take questions.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Matthew. One of the things that first comes to mind that leads right off of what you were just discussing is regarding the reviewers training and how reviewers are taught to formulate their ideas and thoughts back to journal authors, or excuse me, manuscript authors, because like you, I've received, some of the most eviscerating messages of my life from journal reviewers. We always joke about this reviewer two, whoever that person is, who's the one who comes after your blood. But I've also been on the other side of it, and from you as a person as editor for JHC, giving a very kind and helpful feedback, because I don't think that we need to be eviscerated. We need people on our side, so to speak, to be scholars and to be competent professionals and people. So tell all of us, please, a little bit about the training related to the manuscript reviewers at JCD. And if you could speak to the specific pieces related to qualitative research. So it's sort of a two-parter there.
No, it's a great question. Because in the spirit of a good qualitative research, or at least from the ethnographic tradition, right? You immerse yourself, you become a co-participant. And even though starting July 1 of this year, I took over all new submissions, so there was no training for me. When I was a review board member, it was the same thing. Honestly, to complete confession, like I was asked to be a review board member at a dinner at ACA. I mean, that wasn't exactly the most rigorous process, right? And that was like a decade ago. And I think it's changed in some ways. We actually have a process now where you apply to be a reviewer. And with JCD, probably more so than some of the other journals. I think with some of the other journals, you're not begging, but you're really asking people, because there's a lot of work that goes into it if you're being serious about the work, and many reviewers are. That's kind of thankless. You get a little bit of credit, on your CV, but not a lot of credit. And so, there has to be an intrinsic value. With JCD, the assumption is that looking at the total number of their scholarship, the quality of their scholarship, their review experiences, hopefully in some way that reflects future, which is part of the reason why I don't want to just assume that, but also not being naive that the history is, in some ways, once you get in, you kind of get anointed. And so with that in mind, that's why I feel it's incumbent upon me to kind of really not just give a couple of sentences and very kind of ambiguous platitudes about, here's what I thought, but instead, really specific, encouraging feedback. And that's, again, not to placate the authors and this kind of Pollyannish way of looking at their work, because it really is, you can be critical with also still be accommodating and encouraging. And so my way of training is by modeling that and hoping that the reviewers, and trusting them to adopt that if that fits, and if it doesn't, then find new reviewers. I don't want to coerce some folks if that doesn't fit their lives, right? Whether they have time or the ability or whatever, because it still nonetheless is a service to serve as a review board member. Mm-hmm. But it's still, I do think it's a good idea that we think about training. I do send out, when I've served as an editor, memos that I wonder how much folks read, because they tend to be a little bit more loquacious than I intend. I try to make them really, short. And it's like, and again, drawing from the philosopher Pascal, like I think he once said in a letter, sorry, I would have made this shorter had I more time. It's harder to write more compelling stuff in a shorter period of time. But I tend to kind of wax poetic about, here's what I'm looking for in our reviews, and how much people read that and how much they internalize it. In the past, 7 years as JHC editor, and now 4 months as JCD, I really don't know. But I have a kind of like radical faith in people that it does at least do something. So. Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. And to the qualitative side, and Caroline O'Hara had a follow-up question that's pretty similar in the chat around the training related to our reviewers at JCD with qualitative. And this really comes out of the question, I believe, for many of us, which is we've encountered numbers of reviewers over the years with different journals who didn't seem to have a lot of familiarity with qualitative traditions. Sometimes they remember only phenomenology from when they were in their doc program, and our manuscripts get weighed against only knowing phenomenology when it might be CQR or it might be IPA or grounded theory. So will you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, so part of the burden that we have is just the numbers of reviewers and their kind of self-report of expertise.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we try to do is we try to match up two things. Their scholarly area of interest, as they've self-reported, and then their research area of expertise. And and then what happens is after it goes through the review process, the associate editor will get it, and then I will get it, and then we do rate and score our reviewers' reviews. If reviewers generally get anywhere between 5 and 7 a year, it takes a few before we really can see how quality it is. And so, on the one hand, I'm very skeptical of that, because what happens to those first few if we're finding out that these are not, that the acumen of the reviewer is not aligning with their beliefs. I don't know if folks are familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect, but the Dunning-Kruger effect is essentially individuals who are highly skilled have a tendency of underestimating their skill, whereas individuals who are underskilled tend to inflate it. So really skilled people say, no, I'm very humble, and not so skilled people go up. And it just takes a while and incredible memory for me to remember to know who is giving the best feedback. And I don't see a difference in any other journal, honestly, right? And that they're unless we protracted the review process. And what I used to do at JHC is I actually used to have folks do ad hoc for a year, and then help mentor them. But with JHC, we had 50 to 80 submissions a year, and most oftentimes closer to 50. Again, when we're closer to 300 to 500, I try my best to mentor, but a lot of that, I'm just going to have to see how much I can do over time, just to be honest.
For sure. For sure. Thanks so much. I think that's really fair. And I don't think JCD is in a unique position with that. But I was also thinking, when you talked about creating dialogue, if that's something as an editor you would want to hear back from somebody who was rejected, or in the revise and resubmit process of, I'm not sure that this, reviewer two or whomever really understood CQR, understood IPA based on the feedback I received, because I think that we're pretty tenuous as authors to disagree full out at times with our reviewers, because we feel we have to be respectful and want to be respectful. So is that feedback as an editor you would want to receive?
Yeah, within reason. I mean, again, substantiate your claims, right? Use, as you would with a good scholar, use evidence. What things did they say? What things do you have here? And how do you synthesize the space in between those two? Just simply, saying, I don't believe is a belief, right? And beliefs are very important, but nonetheless, they're not necessarily the most scholastic way of handling our work. In fact, with the outgoing editor, Rick Balkin, there was a colleague of ours who had submitted something, it got rejected. The author then came to me and said, what do you think? Because, and I said, I actually think this is really good. And I think that the reviewers just didn't understand some of these methodologies. And I helped him craft something back to Rick, which coincidentally came within a month of the decision of me being elected. And so, it was a little touchy politically at the time, but to Rick's credit, he said, what, I missed it. And I know that there are a number of things. I'm subject to the Dunning-Kruger effect as well, and again, if it's a scholarly retort, I love learning, so let me learn from you. But then I also say, well, if you have to, it's kind of like explaining a joke. If you have to explain a joke, how funny was it the first time? If you have to explain your methodologies in that way, why didn't you explain it in that cogent, coherent way the first time? And so there probably is a space in between. So even sometimes when authors have said that back, I say, there's some truth in what you're suggesting, but nonetheless, here's 3 out of 3, 2 review board members and an associate editor have received your work this way. You might mean it to be something else, but here's how the audience, and they probably most likely reflect the broader audience. Because, our work is so close to our chest sometimes, and so, maybe what you're suggesting that the reviewers missed is true, but how did we articulate it in such a way that they can receive it as useful and as reflective of what you intended?
Mm-hmm. Fantastic, really helpful. We have a question here from Pam Jordan about methodologies. Pam states, you mentioned making sure our studies fall into the specific qualitative design that they purport to. Are the reviewers open to the possibility of generally qualitative designs, that is, those that do not fall into a specific design?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, so I kind of alluded to a philosophic paper. It was actually a back and forth with with James Hansen. We talked about like a number of things, like so-called evidence-based practice. We talked about the preference of qualitative or quantitative research tradition. And my retort had more to do with the symbolic nature, that they really, what makes our research methods meritorious is the ideas that there's these consensualities of intellectuals who agree in the value of these things. Like they really ultimately are constructions around symbols, be it numeric symbols, linguistic symbols. And so all that to say, like if you make a good case for how you couched your ideas within a certain scheme, I think it tells a good story. And in that way, it probably was the best approach. So I think, part of the reason why I'm kind of stumbling through this is I also don't want to make it sound flip, and casual, because I do think there's value in agreed upon, highly and kind of dialogical nature of even research design, that, there's a reason why there's literatures and entire journals on research design, qualitative and quantitative and critical theory and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, like how do we have innovation in how do things kind of emerge into the next discourse if we kind of fall within these kind of rigid parameters? So I think if you make a justification based upon your specific research question, that this is the most effectual approach to pursue this line, then that's great. But that's the same burden of proof that a person would need if something is explicitly, narrative, right? And that's one of the things that I don't see as from many of the articles submitted in any of the journals that I've worked with is, let me tackle this in a different way. I once had an ed psych professor at my old institution say he no longer wants his students to have a chapter 1 because he thought the chapter 1 was just a distilled version of chapter 2. And I thought, no, that's, some erroneous suppositions about the real purpose of a chapter 1 of a dissertation. A chapter 1 of a dissertation, in addition to prefacing the things that you'll later expound upon, it establishes the philosophic substratum of why you studied what you studied. And our introductions to our manuscripts should be as such, right? They should give the bases, not just for the need for the study, but how you chose to pursue it. So it should be very clear from your thesis that there was no other way to study this, because this was the most useful approach. And so I think it's no different from a dissertation as to an empirical article that we submit. If it makes most sense to have a kind of broad brush, qualitative approach, justify that, establish the philosophic argument to that end. And, that's the merit to which we'll evaluate it. I don't know if that helps, but yeah.
Great, thank you. This is a kind of specific question from Carlton Brown. Are brief reports like policy briefs?
That's a good question. So we're still trying to work through what those will be. Most likely what they'll be is, shorter research articles that, and for some reason or another, the design, so like, for example, like action-based research, or where the design will have the rigors of action-based research, but might not necessarily have, from a quantitative tradition, like causal comparative, like the assumptions of causal comparative research. There was no way to do it under those circumstances, but it's still yet very valuable to practitioners. That's kind of the direction that's kind of percolating to the top now. But like I said, we're being a bit slow. It probably will be a year or two before, because I really want to think through that, because I've seen them really well done in some journals, and I've also seen them basically just be lesser versions of the others, and that I don't want that. So I hate to give an ambiguous answer, but we don't really know yet, just because we're thinking through it with lots of deliberation.
Yeah, that's fair. I think it's really interesting to think that you all are trying to break out of the mold a little bit and find ways to become creative with the ways in which you're publishing research, and potentially giving more opportunities, because we know that pages are limited. And I'm sure people ask the question, well, how do we have limited pages when it's mostly an online journal at this point? And has to do with journal, journal, the word is escaping me, but the agreement that you have with Wiley, or with whom you work, and how much that costs.
Yeah, I can actually get more depth with that. So yeah, so it's part of, the bandwidth is negligible in terms of price.
Mm-hmm.
Unique to counseling is that, at least ACA, we have our own in-house copy editors. And there's an incredible advantage to that, because our copy editors and I actually really should have thanked them as well, because they're just amazing and they give so much. And while it can be frustrating after you've, went through multiple revisions to yet nonetheless have one more revision from a copy editor, our copy editors make our writing so much more approachable as compared to other places that will just give a really kind of, piffy cursory read of something and just kind of pass it through. It might help with some formatting type of things. And so there's expense with that as well. And they have their own, and they handle all of the journals. And so one of our greatest expenses in general is the human resources behind that. And so I think, yes, there's the agreements, but then even if we were to try to go back and renegotiate those, it would be a non-starter, just simply because we have a great copy editing team that we don't want to lose. Mm-hmm. So there's that as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I know that page limit is something we qualitative researchers often bring up in these calls, because we often want more pages based on the amount of data that we're reporting and the ways in which we have to report it. So I appreciate you speaking a little bit more to that limitation.
Well, okay, gosh, this is under record, so don't quote me on this, but it's going to be a topic for everyone. I literally this morning in a conversation with Rick Balkin said, I would prefer a longer, high quality manuscript than shorter, lesser quality manuscripts. And so, yeah, in their author guidelines, there's very rigid page restrictions, but I mean, folks could look to my work. Like Rick is, over the years, in the edit, and Skip Niles before him, those are the two editors during my career, have accepted things of my work, and I'm not that much of a hypocrite, just a little, that have far exceeded 30 pages. And I had something this past summer that was a sequential design that included qualitative research and quantitative research. And it was about 45 pages. And when we initially submitted, it was 60, but, similar to qualitative research, our qualitative research wasn't the most dense and lengthy component. It was the hierarchical linear modeling, a growth curve. You can't describe HLM in 30 pages. And, Rick, much as Skip Niles did some of my work before then, said, I want this in here. They were willing to make a concession. And within reason, I'll do the same. It has to really merit it. It has to, in some way, hopefully be kind of a lightning rod topic or study to justify. Because what happens is by privileging that one, it does limit others. And so I'm very cautious, but it is possible. I'll leave it at that. So hopefully that's encouraging. But yeah, like I said, don't hold me to it like you said. But you said, I said that it's possible.
No worries. We're not taking you to court.
On
Jillian,
behalf of the other 38 people, right?
yes, we're having a class action suit from the CEQUIN interest network. Jillian's asked a question about whether you would consider integrating an editorial mentorship program for doctoral students in JCD.
All right. So so my ad hocs that I'd mentored through, most of them were doctoral students for JHC. With JCD, I talked with some of the past editors about this, and there are not doctoral students on the JCD review board any longer. There were, and it has been over a decade ago, but there were some problems with the reviews. And, it's not a perfect science. Just simply saying a person, has been, anointed a doctoral degree just means that they're able to run a good academic marathon. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're the best reviewer. But nonetheless, it's one of the better predictors that we do have, right, is their successes. And so I would be very cautious for a variety of reasons, one of which that history, the other of which is I don't want to create inequity. Whereas, I suggested earlier that there's not a lot of incentive to be a reviewer other than the intrinsic. Like, you learn a ton being a reviewer. So I encourage everyone to be a reviewer. Like, my scholarship has improved greatly as a consequence of being an editor and a review board member. So there's that. But otherwise it's kind of thankless. And I don't want to set differing criteria for the people who apply, because not everyone who applies to be a JCD editor, a reviewer, gets to be on the review board. And so I don't want to privilege while at the same time create different sets of conditions for others. So, I love the idea. I've done the idea. But I'm just, I'm very cautious about equity. So.
Great, thank you. We have time for a few more questions. So folks who are in the audience today, we would love to have a few more questions come in from you all. While we have Matthew here and captive to us to be able to ask more questions, please use the chat function to be able to insert more questions. I'll ask a question in the meantime. What do you see, Matthew, as trends in different types of methodology for qualitative research at this point in our process as a profession?
That's a good question. I mean, I think you kind of alluded to it before, and I'm somewhat of an apologist to it just because of my own affinities. The greatest number we do see is from the phenomenological tradition, but I think that there's a reason why. I mean, that came out of counseling psychology to a lesser, really clinical psychology with Clark and Stockus in the humanistic tradition. And so I think that's the greatest number we see. In terms of trends that I would like to encourage, I alluded to it before, like I would love to see more process and outcome related pieces. So like, what were clients experiencing? What types of things in their lives with it as a client, but then also the things that affected, becoming a client, the experiences as a consequence of being a client or clients, would just be would be a part of our literature that I don't see. But otherwise, in terms of trends, trying to think of some other things that I've just noted over the years that, I mean, that's just really the primary. And, I hate to steal your thunder, but it really kind of echoes what you suggested earlier, like it really, especially at JHC, which again made so much sense at that particular journal. Like we probably had 90% of our qualitative submissions and published articles were in the phenomenological tradition. And so I've received since July 1, I don't know, probably 20 or 30 submissions that are qualitative, and I would guess about 15 of those are phenomenological. So.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. Question from Ashley: thoughts and recommendations on counseling case studies?
I want to make certain I'm answering your question, Ashley. So anything in particular? Like, I think that they're great. I think that the challenge is, oh, and this actually now one of the things in my notes that I forgot to mention. Yeah, and this actually gets to Jennifer's question as well. And this actually will lead to a rejection, because it is one of the trends that is most precarious, and that the lack of sustained engagement, that, you know, an hour interview for 5 or 6 different clients, and it's not even about saturation. It certainly is possible. Again, I'm not an expert in qualitative research. It's certainly possible to get saturation, but one of the assumptions in qualitative research that I was always trained in, and that has always been highlighted to me as a review board member of JCD, was sustained engagement, was getting information from the client across multiple contexts, for trustworthiness. And most all qualitative manuscripts that get rejected across the counseling journals, but especially in JCD, it's because there was not sustained engagement. So relative to case study, you know, being there with the participants in a very depthful, intentional way over a protracted period of time will probably advantage that piece more so than the types that I've seen that are just, you know, we chatted on Sunday. And I'm kind of exaggerating a little bit of hyperbole about that, but not much, honestly. I hope that helps, Ashley. I don't know.
And I think what I'm hearing too is maybe having multiple data sources. So either multiple interviews, or being able to do observations, or having a piece of narrative from that client, something that is going to add to the richness in addition to that 1-hour interview.
That's exactly right. Yeah, there's a variety of ways you can do it, but it comes down to depth. I mean, and those are one of the fundamental axioms of qualitative research that just seems to be neglected in our literature. I mean, there are things like, if I were to do this with the quantitative folks, I would actually give them a little bit more familiarity with that. It would sound like I'd be beating a piñata of like the errors that we make in quantitative research. The ones that I see that, from my experiences relative to qualitative, is we do a lot of things based on convenience as opposed to what is the most effectual way to study a phenomenon, regardless of approach. And I realize that we're all very busy. Our profession is not as funded as well as other disciplines. We're a service profession, so we have to teach and supervise, and so there's lots of things that disadvantage us relative to being able to do that type of work. But nonetheless, the communities of agreement around these methodologies implore us to do those things, and simply not having the time or training or resources to do it doesn't justify it.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, as we wind down here and head into the next hour, I'm curious, do you have any final thoughts you would like to share with us today, Matthew?
So we do have, as always, a huge queue right now. But right now it's a good time to submit, because we're transitioning out of soliciting for a forthcoming special issue, transitioning from one editor to the next, and so high quality pieces, no play on words intended, are something that we are lacking a little bit right now, and so and I would love to see just more high quality pieces, especially things that really illustrate the successes of our profession and the successes of our clients. And yeah. And finally, please do reach out to me, and I'll do my best to have timely responses if something comes to you all later. And I really appreciate the time to talk through these things. And it makes me think more intentionally about just, the variety of interest and approaches that we have in our field.
Absolutely. Well, we 100% appreciate you and your time and the work that you are contributing to our profession through JCD. I'm really grateful that we've gotten a chance to talk with you today, and we hope that you will continue to be an advocate for qualitative research, because that's what we're all about here in CEQUIN, is trying to continue to grow ourselves and our research quality and abilities, and to find additional folks who are advocates for helping us to find better ways to publish. So We appreciate so much your time and your commitment. So thank you for that. To all of our members who have joined us today, thank you so much for joining us. And please remember, this recording will be on the website within the next week. And if you have any interest in working on task forces, hosting at your regional conference, or for considering the position of co-chair coming up for the next year, we would love to hear from you all. So please shoot us an email. My email and Emily's email are in the chat. So thank you all so much. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next time.